welcome back to this moment of our first day of 3 in the Art of Participatory Leadership. I'm now going to introduce you two main mental models that are giving the basis of how we work when we work with groups, and what is our worldview that we held when we do it. So I make that explicit because very often we get into struggles because our worldviews are not clear, and then different worldviews have different expressions towards each other, and we don't even know why we don't understand each other. So here I want just to create a basis for our own understanding, and if you basically would hold another worldview than we do in this work, at least you would understand why if you shift your worldview to this might work, and in another worldview it might not. And lots of things become clear when we start comparing different worldviews, because there are lots of things that we see as difficult or as conflicting. They become clear when we see what's the worldview behind. Not everything gets clear, but quite a lot. So what I would like to introduce first is a system on systems. So which is in itself a bit abstract, but it was the most cognitive and abstract formulation for things that otherwise get a bit too much value loaded, and then people kind of become religious about it. We wanted to keep it as abstract and clear and sharp as possible, so that you can do anything with it, and you don't need to evangelize. So what we want to introduce is a framework called Cynefin by its author, called Dave Snowden, who is a Welsh researcher. And his contribution to the world is, among many other things, that he was reflecting on how can we model complexity in a mathematical way. So that's why it's abstract, it's mathematical. And the heuristic behind all this is that we can basically have 4 leading descriptions for the state in which we find systems. Now this comes obviously from the school of systems thinking, and systems thinking is basically concerned with the question, how do elements that are part of a whole combine so that we have a whole that somehow explains more than the analysis of the parts. So the idea is we have a whole and we have parts, and the combination of the two makes that we have something that we could call a systems phenomena. So the system itself gives a certain quality to what you experience when you are part of these parts, or when you're even opposed to the whole. So what's the nature of the functioning of many elements coming together under something that we call a whole? That whole then is the system. And to keep it simple, there is the state that we call simple. Basically then the system gives a very clear, very unique, and not unique, a very clear systematic answer to everyone. So the system rules everything on a one-on-one relationship. So the system basically would be one descriptor, a set of instructions that make clear to everyone else how one should behave. So it's basically instructions come from the system, only top-down, no feedback loop needed, except kind of order executed boss sort of thing. So this is basically how a machine works. The machine is a set of instructions or a computer program, and following the instructions, the result is predicted and becomes very reliable out of it. So so in that sense, you give a certain set of inputs into a machine, you are clear to get a product out of it. And I bring the machine model to illustrate simple systems because basically it's a mechanical way of modeling the world, and we can create a world according to this model, but it's very much a human creation. Simplicity is not of nature, it's of mankind. It's our simple mind, or our mind that is capable of simple thinking, that creates models that generate simplicity. So the simple world actually is a world of what we call best practice, because for every issue that comes from a simple system, there is a known best and suitable answer. Anyway, whether it's best or not, it's the only answer the system can give. So hopefully we think it's best, but the system basically says what's best because there's only one answer to any question. So here we can talk about best practice. So if you're sharing best practice, the underlying assumption is that we're in a simple world. Okay? Well, there may be something that actually makes it a bit more complicated, in a sense kind of, well, the word in principle could be simple, but somehow it's not so easy. Then we talk about what's complicated, in a sense kind of you have a number of competing simple worlds that they are sort of, and it's not clear which of them is really right. So you need the experts to inform the actual leader of that system, whatever that leader might be. It can be a physical leader, or it can be a human leader, to basically give the right instructions, which we don't know exactly, to different other subparts of that same system. So the basic direction is still top-down in a certain way, but there are many options, and which is the right one needs to be solved by the experts. So basically we have a kind of conflicting and open and debating views in the center of the system, and then the instructions get out to the rest of the world. So sometimes in a complicated world, these instructions are not coming because the complication here is not yet solved. So it may take a little time until we get the right instructions. Whereas the actors here kind of are waiting for instructions and maybe not doing much because they're waiting for leadership, and we can wait the time. So in that sense, if you think of bureaucracy as a way of organizing the social world, it typically works on a complicated worldview idea that you have some committees, parliament decisions, and experts kind of debating about the best course to take, and at some moment it gets all clear, and then the rest of the world is made simple for everyone else. So that is the main idea in complicated view. So here we don't talk about best practice because we know we have competing potential best practices, so we have good practices. And in such a world that's ruled by experts, you may imagine there are certain problems where you really want to rely on a bunch of good experts to get the solution done. So it's not that kind of simple is not good or complicated would not be suitable for quite an array of many issues in the world. Like if you want to construct a bridge over the Mosel River, you would probably have a bunch of experts to find what's the best suitable way of doing the bridge, with what type of materials and what types of budgets and so on. So it's not a simple thing where you simply say it's a bridge. Whether there should be a bridge in the first place may also be touched by the experts. But after a while, they will converge into a good solution, and only 2 or 3 competitive ideas might stay, which anyway a layman then kind of intuitively can take a choice on, knowing that whatever choice they take will be a good choice. And the best choice, well, maybe there is no best choice, maybe only good choices. So this would be the complicated view. Now the interesting thing is there is a third that we also know from 18th century onwards. So this is we know since the 18th century. We had the mechanical worldview very much dominating the whole thinking school in the Western world. Kind of, it was we were all thinking mechanically. That was not only Newton and the natural sciences, but the social sciences alike. Everything was like in mechanical systems. And there was one exception to all that. That was called chaos. So in chaos systems, we have lots of elements. But the idea here is that the elements, they go in all different sorts of directions because they are not constrained. The idea here is of individualism. So each of the elements have their own rule and they follow their own rule, unconstrained by any system. So basically the chaos means there is not a system. There's only elements going in all those sorts of directions. And in chaos, we have the law of probability, in the sense that we may predict what is the average behavior in the chaos, or what are certain kind of outcomes going in different directions. And this you can even predict beforehand if you only know what different type of contents you have in the elements. You may not predict for a specific element how it moves, but for the whole group you could. So all the statisticians here, please correct me if I said something wrong about stochastics and others, but the main idea here is you have independent elements not ruled by any other constraint. Which is in itself, I would say, also a slightly artificial assumption, because we don't find that in nature either completely, but chaos seems to be more natural than complicated or simple. It's less man-made, but it can also be man-made, like in statistical experiments and things like that. So here we talk about, not about any practice or such, but here we talk about probabilities. Now there's something what's not so nice about chaos, because it's not stable. And it tends to converge into something, and if you just have chaos kind of held somewhat, and you start to introduce something that's called light constraints, chaos converges into something that is not complicated and it's not simple. It converges into something that we call complex. And complex is a sort of a new notion in the mathematics of systems, in the sense that complex systems are being studied only since 40, 50 years or so, which in mankind's times of thinking is very, very short. So it hasn't gone through into the curriculum of any basic school training yet. Maybe take another 500 years before we train every child to think complex ways. But maybe it doesn't need to take so long because it's not so difficult actually. It's less complicated than complicated. Although we train everybody to be complicated. So what's complex? Complex is like chaos in the sense that we have different elements that are largely unconstrained, but they're not completely unconstrained. So there's something around that is what we call a light constraint. So we can talk of the system to some extent. So these light constraints make that actors can, to some extent, move independently, but, there's a big but, they cannot do everything. Some things are not possible, not allowed in a certain way, or they are strongly induced to do something like this rather than something like that, which makes probability does not work in complex systems. Predictions about the future are even more impossible than in any other of those systems. So what we can see in complex systems is there is a path that's completely open towards the future, although towards the past it looks like a complicated system with very clear points, turning points going backwards and so on. So if you heard the story of Martina, you clearly heard a story that it was a complex system story because people clearly didn't know how to proceed. They were trying a few things, and only the third attempt they did actually worked out. And they might have tried a few other things before something worked out. So no one should assume that the other things they tried were bad in itself, because they were kind of invented by intelligent people that wanted to really solve the issue, but it was the third thing that worked. And what works in complex systems is not that you have good practice or best practice, or you have pure probabilities that you may calculate. You cannot calculate in complex systems, you can only experiment. And you can experiment until you get to something that is an emergent practice that basically works. So you're constant probing sensing. We call this emergent practice. So that is a good practice for a complex system, something that emerges out of constant probing and sensing, does it work or doesn't it? If it doesn't work, just drop it and try something else. If it does work, amplify it. So that's the whole rule. So working in a complex system is actually much simpler than a complicated system where you have arguing with experts for 20 years until you found the right way to build the bridge. Meanwhile, there is no bridge. So in a complex approach to building a bridge, you might actually kind of have a sort of a test run at a smaller scale to see what are the models that would work and not, but actually would not apply it to a bridge because there you can have experts that know the answers. But complex issues are more where the predictability is completely out. Many elements come together that you can't kind of force to take any action, but you have still a big need to come to a solution. So what you do is you build what we call in our language a container that basically contains the complexity of all the actors, and you invite the actors, maybe through a shared question, to actually start organizing themselves. And by doing so, immersion practice has a chance to come out. So your intervention could be simply, well, something like was beautifully described here in the chart by Martin, who was basically describing how a complex system solving approach works. And if you have the stuck situation where everything is apart, and you built a container around it, which was basically what he said, Eurostat was building a room. So you built that container around that allowed these stuck actors that were all in a complicated freeze, so to speak, to start moving because they were allowed to move more than ever before. And by the self-organization, there was new things coming up that went beyond any expectation or plan that Eurostat ever had. Kind of what we heard in the story is that people were finding solutions to just be with each other that no one in Luxembourg would have ever designed for them beforehand. But they found it anyway. So we had lots of immersion practices coming out. Once we had a light constraint that allowed some movement. So the movement here was from complicated freeze towards complex openness. As much as you can enter complexity from chaos, because it's a self-stabilization that happens if you succeed in stabilizing chaos with some light constraints. So if you over-regulate in a financial crisis, you impose a simple worldview on banks, for instance, but then we only cover the chaos up, and it will come up at another opening the moment you have suppressed it too much. So the simplistic way of solving chaos and introducing crisis management just covers chaos up, and then it will emerge on another moment because it has its own dynamic, and if it's hidden as a chaos, it actually plays out much stronger after some while than the other way around. So I would leave this here as it is and just introduce a way that we call